How does this sound? A paycheck every month, even if you do not have a job. It is called Universal Basic Income, and it's gaining in popularity.
They've been given money whether they choose to work or not.
What happens when you give $500, no strings attached to people? What did you find?
We found that number one, people did not stop working.
If you told me 3 months ago that we would have an extended conversation in any debate here on planet Earth about universal basic income.
A one-year expansion of the child tax credit led to a historic 46% decline in the U.S. child poverty rate. It dropped from 9.7% to 5.2%.
How big of a lifeline were these pandemic-era programs, including the expansion of the child tax credit, for our families?
It was a huge difference for families and for kids. They were able to pay their rent, they were able to pay for food, they were able to pay for childcare. And the difference that these dollars made in these kids' lives could have lasted for a long time if we had been able to extend them, and particularly extend the child tax credit.
A lot of moms out here, they struggling, man. This free money is a blessing.
The answer is it does cause inflation. That's what causes inflation, when you spend money you don't have to give to people who don't deserve it.
What happened to our work ethic in this country? And I think you're right. You know, it was exacerbated with the COVID lockdown. People got comfortable sitting at home, working from home, wanting to get paid more and do less work.
We're living through a time of financial and global crises. The COVID pandemic laid bare the inequalities that were rampant in our society and further exacerbated the already unconscionable economic inequalities in the United States and globally. Usually in such desperate times, governments take drastic measures to try to better society. In the past, those measures have led to increased government programs like Medicaid and Social Security. During COVID, the drastic measures amounted to a couple checks in the mail and a child tax credit that expired the second we were all ready to take our masks off in public again. Now, more than any time in our history, the idea of a universal basic income, a set amount of money paid regularly to everyone unconditionally, should be more popular than ever. And yet decades of misinformation and a governing body that is so dysfunctional that it can barely even pick a leader, let alone pass major legislation, means that inaction on UBI seems permanent. This despite the fact that it has bipartisan support, including support by billionaires like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, presidential candidates like Andrew Yang, and even the king of the conservative free market libertarianism, Milton Friedman. UBI, of course, isn't a silver bullet or an easy fix, but decades of data and experimentation show it has a lot of promise. It's just apathy and political inaction at this point holding it back. So let's make universal basic income sexy again, shall we? Well, the intro. Thank you to my partner on today's video, Factor. You know that I hate cooking, we've established this, that's why I love Factor. Not only that, but the holidays are right around the corner, which comes with a lot of family obligations, office Christmas parties, not for me because I am my own boss, and a lot on your plate. Literally and figuratively. You don't need to also think about having to cook for yourself every day on top of all of that. Plus, I know that I tend to get like sugar hangovers all the time during the holiday season, and I just need a few meals to eat that I know are healthy and have veggies and protein without having to think too hard about it. Factor to the rescue. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen meals straight to your doorstep. No shopping, prepping, or cleaning up required. And they're ready to eat in just 2 minutes. And this ain't your grandma's TV dinner, okay? Factor's meals deliver serious flavor. I love their Indian butter chicken. It's fresh and healthy and ready right away while I'm in the middle of a busy day preparing these videos for you. You could say that Factor meals literally fuel this channel. Wow. And as a special offer just for my viewers, head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Leeja50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Thanks, Factor. Okay, let's get into the basics of UBI because it can seem relatively simple, but it actually has a lot of nuance to it. Generally speaking, Universal Basic Income is a government program where every citizen receives a set amount of money regularly and unconditionally. The goal being to alleviate poverty and give everyone a floor to stand on. The question of exactly who gets the money, all adults, children too, how frequently they get the money, once a year, every month, how much money that should be, $1,000, $500, as much as is sustainable, and how it should be taxed, like a negative income tax, a corporate tax, an income tax, are all variables and are all up for debate. Proponents of UBI point to the importance of a basic income, a ground to stand on, especially in the face of increasing innovation like AI that could put upwards of a quarter of Americans out of a job over the next decade. Additionally, a basic income that is unconditional, meaning everyone gets it, there's no income or work requirements, means that those who need help but can't currently benefit from government programs for various reasons would still get the help they need. For example, someone who needs to receive disability insurance may not have the ability to go to a doctor to get the paperwork necessary to verify their disability. It would mean fewer people falling through the cracks in the red tape and getting their desperately needed benefits denied or cut. It would also mean a reduction in bureaucratic oversight, because there would be no need for analyzing whether or not someone qualifies. Everyone gets the money, no matter what. It also removes the paternalism of government aid programs, where third parties get to come in and decide how or whether a poor person gets to spend the money given to them. It provides common dignity and respect to recipients that is lacking in current government programs. It would also benefit the economy, as it would give people the opportunity to leave work and seek additional education. It would put more power in the hands of workers, because now no one would be quite as beholden to a job where they're being underpaid and mistreated, restoring a power balance that's been lost as income inequality has grown. Studies have shown that it would also increase happiness and reduce anxiety, because the only people who believe money doesn't buy happiness are the ones who've never been poor, because the relief that comes from knowing you have long-term regular income, even if that income isn't enough to live off of, but is enough to ensure you have food and shelter, creates so much mental and emotional relief, and that does lead to happiness. It also leads to increased sense of self-worth and efficacy, which can lead to better job performance, better parenting, and an overall higher quality of life. Having a guaranteed income would also lead more people to take entrepreneurial risks, start that business they've been dreaming about, thereby further stimulating the economy and creating more jobs. Proponents of UBI also point to the fact that there is exceedingly economically valuable labor being done outside of the paid workplace, especially by women in caregiving roles. UBI would recognize the value of that labor and allow people to take time to care for children or the elderly where they normally would not be able to. UBI would also allow people in abusive or unstable homes more freedom to leave. Instead of simply rewarding rich people for the act of hoarding money in the stock market and moving it to offshore holdings, activities that notably do not stimulate or add to the economy, UBI would help lift people out of poverty, give them dignity and freedom of choice, and allow them to be more productive members of society. And that all sounds very utopian and nice, so why is there such resistance to the idea of a universal basic income? We'll get to the present-day objections in a moment, but one reason for inaction on UBI is because of the long history of vilification and overcomplication of the idea. The idea of some form of universal basic income has been around for centuries. English statesman and philosopher Thomas More, in his 1516 book Utopia, describes a society where every person receives a guaranteed income. His reasoning goes, no penalty on earth will stop people from stealing if it's their only way of getting food. Instead of inflicting these horrible punishments, it would be far more to the point to provide everyone with some means of livelihood so that nobody's under the frightful necessity of becoming first a thief and then a corpse. Thomas Paine, the writer and pamphleteer who wrote Common Sense and other pamphlets that were influential to the start of the American Revolution, also wrote of a universal basic income in his essay Agrarian Justice from 1797, in which he proposed a universal social insurance program funded by a 10% tax on land inheritance, saying, "Men did not make the earth. It is the value of the improvements only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property. Every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds." The sentiment was repeated in 1848 by Belgian socialist Joseph Charlier, who recommended a territorial dividend to generate regular income for the people. And again by American political economist and journalist Henry George, who proposed a broad social support system from a tax on land and natural resource value, such that social support would be distributed to residents as a right instead of as a charity. The idea being that economic value derived from the the land should belong equally to all members of society. Nobel Prize-winning British economist James Mead similarly suggested in the 1930s a form of social dividend to share the wealth produced by the land and by previous generations. The idea of a UBI was particularly popular around that time in England. During World War II, the Beveridge Committee, led by British economist William Beveridge, developed a proposal for a new welfare system, including unconditional allowances for children. One member of the committee, Lady Rice Williams, argued in favor of universal income for adults as well. She was also the first person to develop the negative income tax model, which Milton Friedman later popularized. We'll get into what that means later. World War II also saw an unprecedented expansion of government services in the US, especially in the form of the GI Bill, which helped provide jobs, free education, and housing to returning veterans, and laid the foundation for the economic expansion that followed after the war. Taxes on excess profits, so businesses weren't profiteering from the war, helped to fund these greater social programs. Despite the fact that the government felt the pinch of the costs of war, it still made huge expenditures in the face of a crisis in order to ensure that its people, or most of them because racism and sexism, were provided for. But because of the nature of these programs, which were based on need and included the paternalistic arm of the government to determine whether or not someone was eligible, which included baked-in biases against women and people of color, by the 1960s, a civil rights movement was mobilizing for further government action. Martin Luther King Jr. was a proponent of UBI, proposing in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here?, a guaranteed income for all. He pointed out that government aid programs have a common failing. They are indirect. Each seeks to solve poverty by first solving something else. I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. The Black Panthers' 10-point program called for employment or guaranteed income for everyone. Feminist proponents of the wages for housework movement called for income separate from labor as a way to weaken the prominence of the male breadwinner model. On the other side of the political divide, neoliberal economist Milton Friedman argued as early as 1962 in his book Capitalism and Freedom that a negative income tax would help contribute to a universal basic income and create a sense of everyone being in it together, saying, "We might all of us be willing to contribute to the relief of poverty, provided everyone else did." He saw negative income taxes as a way to replace the entire welfare state and overcome administrative inefficiencies. Negative income tax isn't exactly the same thing as a basic income, but it functions similarly. Basically, the government would give everyone cash and then apply a tax to that government payment based on income levels, so everyone would receive the cash, but then wealthier people would ultimately have it taxed away so that it mainly benefited lower income people. It has largely the same effect as if you give out a basic income and then increase income taxes so that people in the higher tax brackets pay more to offset the cost of the UBI. But the negative income tax is just more palatable for the fiscally conservative types who don't want to feel like their own hard-earned cash is being taxed by the man. Lyndon B. Johnson's push to fight the war on poverty was met with increased push for a universal basic income as well. A document signed by 1,200 economists at the time called for guaranteed income for every American. Richard Nixon, of all people, introduced the Family Assistance Plan, which would have provided additional cash to poor families through a negative income tax, which would have provided up to $1,600 or $13,000 in today's money per year to a family of four. It was his response to calls to replace the welfare system. It never made it out of the Senate Finance Committee, though. By the 1970s, the main competitor to basic income and negative income tax was the Earned Income Tax Credit, which comes in the form of a tax credit on your year-end tax form if you earned below a certain threshold. The amount of the credit varies depending on income and whether you have children. This was more attractive because it had certain limits based on income and children, meaning that it wasn't unconditional, and it was a tax credit instead of income paid straight into the pockets of Americans in the form of a check, which feels less socialist. So the Earned Income Tax Credit and its proponents won out in the end. Today, renewed interest in the idea of a UBI has been spurred by growing income and wealth inequalities made all the worse by the COVID pandemic. Andrew Yang, as candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2020, called for a freedom dividend of $1,000 per month to be paid to everyone over the age of 18. Pope Francis, in a 2020 Easter letter, wrote that a universal basic wage would ensure and concretely achieve the ideal at once so human and so Christian of no worker without rights. And now with the explosion of AI driven by ChatGPT and other recent innovations, coupled with the growth in the labor union movement and fight for rights of low-paid service industry and gig workers, means that a UBI is once again being examined as a potential solution to all of society's ills. And during COVID, the government did get a little bit more comfortable with the idea of direct cash handouts to citizens through its COVID stimulus checks. And in 2021, the government took an additional step by expanding the child tax credit to include monthly payments and removal of work requirements for parents. This alone affected nearly a third of all children in the United States, 1 in 3, including 52% of Black children, half of them, and 41% of Hispanic children, and lifted 3.7 million kids out of poverty without any sign of reduction in the participation rate of parents in the workforce. And when the child tax credit expansion ended in January 2022, those 3.7 million children fell back into poverty. It proved beneficial to children and families, but showed the serious shortcomings that come from short-term provisions like COVID stimulus checks and a single year of child tax credits. It's not enough to move the needle in any meaningful way or to reap the full benefits of a UBI scheme. A study out of Colombia found that a permanent expansion of the child tax credit would have generated 10 times as much revenue as it cost in better health outcomes, increased education attainment, and more. And that highlights a major problem facing any legislation aimed at permanent universal basic income. No one's ever done it before, and all the projected outcomes are just educated guesses at this point. And that's a hard pill to swallow because it's a lot of money up front, especially for fiscal conservatives and those in higher income levels, including the people who run this country, who would be tasked with helping to fund any sort of UBI measure. That's not to say, however, that there isn't heaps of promising data from pilot programs all over the world that have been testing various UBI schemes for decades with very promising results. In the 1970s, when UBI and negative income tax was gaining popularity due to the war on poverty and Milton Friedman, a series of experiments were conducted in cities across the country where they tried various cash grant sizes and different rates of phasing out the grants based on income to take a detailed look at how different components of a UBI scheme would affect outcomes. Unfortunately, analysis of the outcomes of that experiment at that time were done by those in favor of the earned income tax credits and not negative tax schemes. So therefore, they were likely biased and incomplete. And they found that those receiving the money benefited personally and financially, but that there was a modest reduction in the number of hours that they worked and the amount of money they earned. And this was enough to spook Nixon and lead many at the time to declare the experiment's definitive proof that UBI and negative income tax don't work and lead to laziness in its recipients. However, numerous analyses of the data in the decades since the experiments were conducted paint a very different picture. The Brookings Institute noted that the experiments relied on self-reported earnings information. When official government records were referenced, the effects on labor hours and income disappeared. It's also important to take the full context of the situation into account. Researchers at the time didn't find any evidence that workers were dropping out of the workforce entirely. The reality was that people were working less on average because of longer spells of unemployment, indicating not that they decided to just relax now that they had the cushy government income, which, reminder, none of these schemes involve enough money to live comfortably on, but instead that they felt more safe leaving bad jobs in search of better ones or waiting a bit longer to find a job that was a better match, which in the long run could likely mean higher job satisfaction and less turnover, not to mention greater sense of well-being and purpose, which perhaps doesn't have a clear economic measure, but is certainly worthy of consideration. People were also withdrawing from the labor force to pursue more education or to take care of children or sick loved ones. The more recent study of the 1970s pilot programs found that the negative income tax increased the odds of completing high school by 25 to 30%, and there was some evidence that children in households participating in the program did better overall on standardized tests. The general conclusion of those who have studied the pilot programs conducted in the 1970s is that a national negative income tax big enough to eliminate poverty is a budgetarily viable option, and more recent pilot programs in the US have continued showing positive results. One slightly less obvious program is the annual dividend program in Alaska. Every year since 1982, the state of Alaska has given all of its citizens a check, unconditionally, from the Alaska Permanent Fund, a state-owned investment fund financed by oil revenues. The checks aren't enough to live on. They range from $1,000 to $2,000 per person per year, but it's been enough to wipe out extreme poverty in the state. Economists who have studied the effects of the program have found the dividend had no effect on employment overall, so no one was working less because of the money, but it has had an effect on fertility, encouraging families to have more kids. Since 1997, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina have distributed a yearly casino dividend to spread the wealth generated by casinos on tribal land. The money is given to every tribal member unconditionally and generally amounts to $4,000 to $6,000 per year. Economists have found again that it doesn't make anyone work less, but it does lead to improved education and mental health and decreased addiction and crime. More recently, the mayor of Stockton, California, Michael Tubbs, created Mayors for a Guaranteed Income and spearheaded a pilot program called the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, or SEED, in 2019. The program gave 125 residents $500 per month for 24 months, unconditionally with no work requirements or strings attached. They then studied the results, and the results showed that the guaranteed income works. It pulls people out of poverty, improves health outcomes, makes it easier for people to find full-time employment, and take care of their children. More than 50% of the participants said that they could pay for a $400 emergency with cash, compared with 28% in the control group. Recipients also experienced statistically significant improvements in their mental health and well-being. The biggest share of the cash was spent on food, followed by utility bills, gas, and car maintenance. Less than 1% of the total funds were used to buy tobacco or alcohol, which is important to point out because those who support a more paternalistic approach to government aid always cry that the money will be used for nefarious purposes, while also spending their own money on drugs and alcohol and tobacco. But lo and behold, when you trust a poor person with money, they use it for things they actually need, like food and paying the bills. And while these pilots all provided promising data, they fall short in the same way that COVID stimulus checks and child tax credits did. After 2 years of $500 per month, or a total of $12,000 per person, the program ended. Many people saw great benefits over that 2-year period, but many were also left in the lurch when the payments stopped and they no longer had that support. Pilot programs have been important to gather some data to show the basic viability of a program of universal basic income, but it's truly impossible to accurately extrapolate that data into a model for what might happen were the plan to spread nationwide. And this is a major sticking point for many of UBI's detractors. There's no way to know exactly how it would play out because we don't have a program long enough or large enough to show us. It would take a little faith and actually just doing it in order to find out, at least at a state level. First, we must fuck around before we may find out. And because of this uncertainty, all sorts of objections as to the potential outcomes of a nationwide UBI have surfaced. One of the main objections is around funding. Who's paying for this? Andrew Yang, when he proposed a universal $1,000 per month stipend, set out a funding plan that relied on shrinking the size of existing social programs, imposing a 10% value-added tax, or VAT, on businesses, ending the cap on Social Security payroll taxes, and taxing carbon emissions. An analysis by the Tax Foundation found that this revenue-generating plan would only cover about half of its total impact on the Treasury. However, other estimates find that a UBI plan set to 100% of the poverty line would only cost about 1.5% of the gross national product per year on top of existing welfare programs. This would increase the cost of the federal government from 21.1% of the GDP to 22.6% of the GDP, a relatively modest increase. A means-tested income would have a lower upfront cost on paper because it would phase out as people make more money, meaning less out-of-pocket expenses for the government than if there was a UBI that was then funded through greater taxes in the form of negative income taxes or increased graduated income taxes. But the drawbacks of programs that create conditions like income amounts is that the benefit of less government bureaucracy is reduced because you need bureaucracy to make make eligibility determinations. When everyone is eligible, no determinations are necessary, but a means-tested minimum income may be more politically viable than an increase in income taxes because it requires less upfront costs. Another common objection to UBI is that some people feel that no one should receive a free handout from the government. Everyone should have to work for their income. As I stated before, pilot programs have generally shown that no one works less when they receive a basic income. The point of the basic income is to be less than is necessary to live comfortably, but enough to avoid abject poverty in the richest country in the world. A UBI also acknowledges that having a job is not the only form of work that benefits society. UBI gives people the chance to finish high school, care for their children, care for their sick loved ones, attain higher education, or start a business. This is all work that is incredibly economically important, but not immediately income generating. There's also the objection that giving everyone a universal basic income would simply just raise the economic bar, causing inflation that would undo any potential benefit from the UBI. Proponents, however, argue that this is an overly simplistic view of how inflation works. The impact of a UBI would also depend on unemployment levels, taxes, the availability of goods, the rate of domestic production, the country's debt level, and the cost of fossil fuels. The pure act of increasing incomes doesn't necessarily lead to increased inflation, and the measures that would have to be taken to reduce inflation at all costs, like lowering wages and increasing taxes, are unattractive and don't create a world that we want to live in. So the reality is that some compromise has to be made. Compromises we actively already make today in our government, such as minimum wages, and the pure desire to reduce inflation can't trump all other considerations. Plus, the increased purchasing power and freedom to enter into small business ownership that a UBI provides would increase competition, which works to check price increases. There are also objections on the left from people who are concerned that a UBI would give legislators the green light to start slashing all other government programs, saying, well, there's a UBI, so no one needs free education or healthcare. This is a fair criticism and would likely require some form of controls to be put in place to ensure that general quality of life isn't lowered just because people are now receiving a $1,000 check every month. Another criticism from the left is just how popular the idea of a universal basic income is with rich people. Elon Musk says it's necessary. Richard Branson points to the sense of self-esteem that universal basic income could provide to people. Mark Zuckerberg is in favor of it. And as we know, anything that rich people support is largely out of self-interest. So what's in it for them? Well, for one, a UBI in theory is simple and requires few new regulations or rules. It also alleviates the billionaire conscience. Now that no one is in abject poverty, people will stop holding billionaires accountable for ending world hunger or whatever, and they can feel less guilt about exploiting labor and gaining more and more wealth. A UBI also creates a sense of meritocracy, that if everyone gets a boost, then that means that the winners of the economic race are there because of their merits, their skill and expertise and talents and knowledge, not because of the dumb luck of inherited wealth and connections. Another fair criticism is that a UBI could lead to the creation of a ceiling, not a floor. Employers will now have no incentive to pay their employees a good wage because they can point to the UBI as supplementing meager wages. And while workers would likely have more bargaining power when they're not entirely dependent on a job to keep a roof over their head, this will likely mainly benefit the lowest paying jobs that most people don't want to do. But more competitive white-collar jobs, where workers are often paid in prestige and connections, those would be able to continue paying meager wages or even lower wages because they can point to the UBI as providing a floor for their workers, and those that would benefit would be the wealthier workers, those born into wealth, who then were less dependent on a salary to make ends meet. And so the fear is that more prestigious jobs would be filled by higher net worth individuals who could handle the lower wages. Because it turns out, a universal basic income is not a silver bullet that would solve all our problems. It would raise the floor, but it wouldn't do away with the inherent inequalities baked into our system. There may need to be new regulations put in place to ensure equality, something that then causes UBI to lose its appeal for many of its supporters who love it because of its supposed simplicity and lack of regulations. And there is no clear political path forward for UBI. Now that COVID is seen as less of an emergency and things are returning to some semblance of normal, the end of the expanded child tax credit in 2022, which was seen by many as a stepping stone towards a UBI, happened because Joe Manchin, a Democrat, blocked it, despite representing the state with the 6th highest poverty rate in the country. It turns out that citing statistics isn't enough to change hearts and minds. And short-term upfront costs almost always trump less tangible long-term benefits. Because the statistics show time and again that UBI would be beneficial for the segment of our country that needs it most. And it's more than just an economic policy. It recognizes the shared wealth we create when we lift each other up. It acknowledges that other humans are deserving of support, and it provides a level of dignity and a removal of social stigma that holds so many people back in the richest country in the world. And I will say, despite the fact that UBI is supported by many wealthy people, especially in the tech sector, I think this once again, as with all of my videos lately, comes back to getting money out of our politics. Hear me out. A recent Pew Research poll found that 63% of people in lower income households favor a UBI. 67% of people under 30 favor a UBI. 73% of Black respondents and 63% of Hispanic respondents favor a UBI. Only 8% of high income Republican respondents favored a UBI. The statistics show that the older, whiter, and richer you are, the less you support UBI. Given the numbers of old, rich, white people in our Congress, this is basically a death knell for any hope of UBI being passed anytime soon. Studies also show that the expense of running for office, spurred on by increased campaign donations from big business and private billionaires, means that the only people who can even run for office and actually win that office are wealthy, which means they tend to be older and whiter because old white people have most of the wealth. Removing the influence of money from our politics would allow for a more diverse group of people to run for office, those that represent the interests of lower income people and people of color, the groups of people who are most likely to be in favor of UBI and the groups that stand to gain the most from it. Getting money out of our politics doesn't directly lead to a UBI, but it does remove the barriers to creating a more equitable country for everyone, and that's something that I can get behind. If you liked this video, you might also like my video about how lobbying is ruining our democracy. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, and Brett Piontek. If you're interested in behind-the-scenes content, access to my research and notes, content about my dog, and all sorts of other stuff, consider joining me over on Patreon today. Also, I'm giving away 4 free books inspired by the videos I've released over the last month. This giveaway is for Patreon supporters only, and it ends tonight. So to enter, go to patreon.com/Leeja Miller. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.